Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Today, I'm here with New York Times bestselling author Jeff Shaara. Mr. Shaara, thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure.
So I posted a review on Mr. Shaara's one of his books earlier, To Wake the Giant, and this was a realistic fiction novel about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and it was a book that I really enjoyed. So I decided to reach out to you. I'm really happy. Thank you so much for coming on. And I'll get right into it. Do you just want to, I guess, like introduce yourself, tell anybody just the basic stuff?
Well, I write historical fiction, but unlike a lot of historical fiction, the facts are straight. The history is accurate. My job is to take you with me back in time to different major historical events in our history and put you there with some of the most well-known, most famous people, uh,
Mhm.
and tell you the story the way they would tell it from their own point of view. My research is huge. The research is the largest part of it. To do the research, to get into the heads of the characters, to hear the voices, so that I can put words in the mouths of these historical figures. If I don't do that, the voices of these characters will come across as pretty counterfeit, and the book simply doesn't work. So it's really important that I do my homework and to try to get it right. The other part of getting it right is to keep the facts straight, keep the history accurate. I began to hear years ago that teachers were using my books in their classroom to teach history. They're novels, so it's a risky thing to do
Uh-huh.
use a novel to teach history. But what the teachers were saying is they could trust that the history was accurate, and if you give the student a character they could relate to, they didn't even realize they were learning the history.
Hmm.
So that was a huge compliment. But so in every book I've done, that's my goal, is to get back into the heads of these characters and tell you their story from their point of view.
Yeah, so like when we this year my class is US history for our history class, and like our assignment for the summer was to they gave us 10 different books, and they were like history based books, and that's how they pretty much had us like go into it. And like that's what I noticed. I read this one book about the Vietnam War, and like that was a really easy read for me because it was just like I was following a character, a soldier who was in Vietnam, and that just like it was an easy way for me to get into the book and also learn the history about it. So, if I'm correct, was your dad also a writer?
Yeah, my father was a writer all his life. He was a failed writer, as most writers are. He could never make a living from his writing. He started out in the 1950s as a science fiction writer.
Hmm.
He wrote a number. He published over 70 short stories in all the science fiction magazines of the day. He went on to write a lot of straight fiction short stories. And then he wrote a novel, and it came out in 1968 called The Broken Place. And it's a novel that nobody read. And if you've never heard of it, that's okay, because nobody's ever heard of it. The book did nothing at all, but it was his second book, based on a trip that we took to Gettysburg as tourists. He became obsessed with the story of what happened at the Battle of Gettysburg, and he wrote this book, and it's called The Killer Angels. The book won a Pulitzer Prize.
I was gonna ask about that. That I heard that
Yeah,
he.
I mean,
Sir.
my father tried to sell the book. It was turned down by 15 publishers. If you think about when this book was finished, 1974,
Mhm.
the end of the Vietnam War. So any book about generals, which is what my father's book is about, Civil War generals, was very much out of fashion. Nobody wanted to read this. And even though a year later it wins a Pulitzer Prize, but it was never a successful book, commercially successful. That was a bitter disappointment to my father. A writer wins a Pulitzer Prize, he has every right to believe that his ship has come in. Anything he wants to do is going to be
Yeah.
popular. None of that ever happened to my father. So it was tough for him to go on. He went on. He actually wrote some other things. He wrote a sort of a Hitchcock sci-fi novel that nobody read. And then he wrote a baseball novel called For Love of the Game, which Kevin Costner made into a movie.
Hmm.
Uh, but
That's
the
awesome.
movie was made well after my father's death. He didn't live to see that. He also didn't live to see the film Gettysburg, which was based on the Killer Angels. When the film Gettysburg came out in 1993, it made the Killer Angels a #1 bestseller 5 years after my father's death. So he had no idea what he left behind. And to this day, the Killer Angels, the paperback version of the Killer Angels is right now in its 129th printing. I mean, there are not
That's
many books you
crazy.
can say that about. That's amazing. And he had no idea. He just simply didn't live to see any of that.
And is it true? So I was looking through the books that you've read. So the first couple books that you wrote, weren't they like a prequel and the sequel to your father's books?
When the film Gettysburg came out, it was enormously successful. And the people who did the film, who put the money up, the producers and so forth, they came to me because they said they wanted to do more films because
Yeah.
my father's book just covers 4 days. It's just the Battle of Gettysburg. They wanted to go before and after, more, a lot of the same characters and tell the story the same way my father had told it. And I had never written anything before. I mean, that's
Really?
not false modesty. I mean, I was a dealer in rare coins and precious metals in Tampa, Florida. I had no experience as a writer, but I thought about this, and the idea is to write a prequel and a sequel to my father's book. And I
Hmm.
thought, this is something I think I want to try to do and just see what happens. And, I'm often asked, how did you know how to write a book? I had no idea. I had no clue. And we had the conversation with the filmmakers that if whatever I come up with is lousy, nobody's ever going to know. So
Hmm.
there was no fear. I mean, I'll tackle this and see what happens. Well, meanwhile, I'm representing my father's estate in New York with the publisher of the Killer Angels, and I told her what I was doing. I said I'm working on the prequel, and it's called Gods and Generals. And she said, "Oh, well, why don't you send us the manuscript?" Okay, I sent them the manuscript. The phone call I got back from Random House in New York is, we don't care if it's a movie. We like the book and we think you're a writer and here's a contract. That changed my
Right
whole
there.
life. Gods and Generals comes out in the spring of 1996, comes out, and it makes me feel old to say that, but the book comes out and makes its debut on the bestseller list, something my father never saw in his whole career. And I was under no illusions that the great American author had arrived. I knew that people wanted more of the Killer Angels. People were hoping that this book would be, something comparable that they could enjoy. It worked. And then I did the sequel. It was called The Last Full Measure, and with the same result. And, with that, it's sort of in my pocket. Now I'm a writer. And I mean, that was 19 books ago. And like I said, I mean, this is not exaggerating to say my whole life changed with that one phone call from the publisher.
Hmm. And then since then, have you been a full-time writer?
Yes, and the difference between my father and me, my father used to teach. He taught creative writing and literature at Florida State University, but he taught to make a living because he could never make a living from his writing. I am very fortunate, and I know that it's very unusual because like I say, I know a lot of
Yeah.
writers, and to make a living from your writing is a difficult thing to do, and I'm very, very fortunate about that.
Yeah, no, because I've heard it from other authors too, who I've talked to. They're like writing is it's really hit or miss. Like if you're able to get that one book out there that can, really vault you there, then you're in the game. You can put more stuff out. Like if you see a lot of people, I mean, most authors who have like made it big off their writing, a lot of them wrote series or something like that. So like it is rare. So that's like awesome because those books were, I mean, essentially a series, right? You were essentially finishing what your father did. And then from there, you've just every single book has been something based off. Have you kept it strictly US fiction?
Pretty much,
What's up?
yes. I mean,
History.
there are foreign characters. Um, I did a two-book set on the American Revolution where there's a British character, a different character in each book.
Hmm.
Um, as I get more modern, as I got up into World War One, World War Two, there are German characters, Japanese characters. There are characters on the other side. The point I learned from my father when he did about the Battle of Gettysburg with the Killer Angels, he was absolutely right down the middle. You know, two Southern characters, two Northern characters. There's no bias. You're completely neutral in the center,
Mhm.
and that's a lesson that has stuck with me. So when I did, for example, when I did World War One, I mean, there are German characters in there as well as American characters. You have to have that. You have to show both points of view in order to tell a fair story. I mean, one of the German, I'll give you an example. One of the German characters is the Red Baron, you know, Manfred von Richthofen,
Mhm.
a character that a lot of people thought was only a cartoon character. In fact, no, he was a real guy and he was the real deal. And he was a fabulous pilot and a tremendous warrior in the air. And you know, he was not a Nazi. There were no Nazis in World War One.
Mhm.
So you know, when you look at him, he's a three-dimensional human being, and he's a very sympathetic character. His death is very emotional, and he's the bad guy. I mean, he's
Uh-huh.
on the other side, and
Yeah.
that point is to tell a story where there are no bad guys. That you know, you're telling a story from both points of view.
Yeah, because in To Wake the Giant, which is the book of yours that I've read and just really enjoyed. Actually I stumbled across, so in our English class we have 20 minutes of just reading time before every we have a 90-minute class, and 20 minutes of just independent reading. So I'd finish my other book, and then just like my teacher's just like a bunch of books on a shelf, which are like she's like, okay, these are books that I think you guys might enjoy. So I just saw the cover of To Wake the Giant because it's like a pretty vivid, like colorful cover. And I was like, okay, this looks good. I had no idea what it was about. I didn't know it was like a World War II novel until I actually started reading it. I just looked at the cover. I was like, okay, I'll read it. And then from there, I just every single class time I was reading it, and it's just that's right. I did really enjoy that. I enjoyed because you had what General Yamamoto. I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right,
Right, exactly.
but
Yamamoto.
you had
You
his
have
point of
Japanese, well, I just said, you have Japanese voices in this story.
yeah,
Most people, if you mention Pearl Harbor, they're going to tell you, oh, yeah, I know what happened to Pearl Harbor. You know, there were the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, the Arizona blew up, you know, all of this kind of stuff. But what about the story? I mean, there's so much more that happened there that most people simply are, well, they're never taught, and most people simply don't know. And it's interesting. I
it
mean,
is.
it's a good story. So you've got the Japanese points of view, Commander Genda, you know, and you've got these fabulous characters. Then you've got the sailor, you know, Tommy Biggs, the
Yeah,
sailor who he happens to be stationed on the Arizona. And what happens to him? He survives, but what happens, what he witnesses, what he goes through, I mean, it's a tremendous story that most people simply don't know. They watch a 5 minute documentary about Pearl Harbor and they assume they know what happened there,
uh,
but there's so much more to what happened behind the scenes, and it's fun to write because it is so interesting.
yeah. No, because like I didn't know what. Correct me if I got anything wrong, but it was like what the day before the U.S. had taken all their planes out from Pearl Harbor or something like that. Then there was like miscommunication between, I think it was like the Navy and the Marines or whoever it was that were like patrolling. Because you said then the Japanese had like submarines that went in there, and then
You know, there
obviously,
was all kinds of miscommunication. I mean, it was a disaster of miscommunication. I mean, one of the things that happened that actually worked out for the best is the Americans had sent the aircraft carriers out of Pearl Harbor. They
Mhm.
were out, you know, in the open sea. Well, the Japanese came in there looking for the aircraft carriers. That
They
was their
weren't there.
goal. That was their primary mission, was to blow up the aircraft carriers, and they weren't there. So they settled
Ships.
for the battleships. And of course, it was quite a dramatic disaster for the Americans. But had the aircraft carriers been in Pearl Harbor, it would have been a whole lot worse, and probably would have gone and given the Japanese a tremendous advantage, possibly in winning the war.
Hmm. Yeah, no, because I really enjoy that. I thought Tommy Biggs' story for me personally was like I feel like when you read books which have a POV change, then you generally tend to find like that one character. At least that's the case for me. Like whenever I've read a book which has multiple people's it's told from multiple people's point of view, I've always had like that one character that you always enjoy reading more about. than the others. And for me, it was Tommy Biggs. I also think that you probably focused on Tommy. I felt like you focused on Tommy a little more because I felt like the aspect of the common man, like
Right.
the average soldier who people don't necessarily talk about. They just talk like what they say, the people that pass away, they refer to them in like as just a group of people, like as oh, all the soldiers die, but like you forget that each of these soldiers were their own unique person. Everybody had their own unique story.
In my track record, with my list of novels, one of the things I learned from my father when he did The Killer Angels is he did it from the top down. His primary characters in that book are all generals. They're all the boss. And that worked for me. I did that. I did the same thing because I didn't know any better until I got to World War One, and I realized that by the time the military gets to the First World War, the generals aren't leading the attack anymore like they were in the Civil
Yeah.
War. They're back there. I mean, they're behind the lines, 10 miles away. So to write the story from the point of view of nothing but the generals doesn't work anymore. You have to get that kid, that guy out there, out front, and tell his story because he's the one who's actually seeing what's going on. And that's the same exact situation with a character like Tommy Biggs. Is you have to have that. I could have simply written it from the point of view of the captain of the Arizona who dies. The rear admiral who goes down with the ship.
Yeah.
But that to me, that's not as interesting a story as the sailor who's right there, right on ground level, and what he has to live with.
I agree. And so just like shifting over a little bit, I was going to ask you about your writing as a whole. Other than, of course, I'm sure the first books, what has been the book which you said every book involves a lot of research? Which book is like involved, would you say, the most research out of any of them that you've done?
That's a tough one because I do an enormous amount of research. It has to be that way. In
Mhm.
every book that I've done, I did a book on Korea, the Korean War, the Chosin Reservoir in Korea with the Marines against the Chinese, and what that was like for just a handful of Marines, guys on the ground,
Mhm.
uh, and that took. First of all, I had living veterans to talk to,
Mhm.
all of whom are gone now, which is a shame. But I got a guy come sit in my living room and tell me his stories about being at the Chosin Reservoir. I mean that was pretty intense. But and that kind of research, you really owe it to these guys to get it right. You
Mhm.
really owe it to these guys if you're going to tell their story, get all the facts straight. It's a question of respect. To show respect to all these people. So that was one that I put a lot more into than probably just about anything else. In the book, it's called The Frozen Hours, and the book won 3 awards, including an award from the Marine Corps and an award from the Congressional Medal of Honor Society, which is about the nicest thing that's ever happened to me. So it's nice to get recognized when I've done my work, and I feel I'm proud of what I've done. I feel like the book deserves some attention and it gets
Mhm.
that attention. That's pretty neat.
Would you rather have your book have would you rather have it that your book would be like a commercial success, or in your case, if you had to like pick which do you think is like more valuable to you, the awards or like a commercial success?
It's both, and it has to be that way. I'll tell you why. I mean, it's first of all, it's extremely gratifying. I mean, behind me on the wall back there are some plaques. There are four. I'm the only 4-time winner of a certain award that the American Library Association gives every year. I mean, that's great. That's wonderful stuff. But at the same time, I do this for a living.
Yeah.
If all you get is awards and nobody ever buys my book, I can't really do this anymore. So, and I got in an argument one time with a couple of authors, and we were on a panel discussion somewhere, and they were so obnoxious and so pretentious, and they were talking about that they create art with their writing, and and art and literature and all of this. And I finally, when it was my turn to talk, I said, I'm sorry, but any publisher in New York will tell you writing is not about creating art and literature. It's about selling books. And, if you want to be a successful published author, it's wonderful to get an award, but if you don't sell any books, who cares? I appreciate the one. I certainly appreciate the awards. But at the end of the day, it's about selling books.
And I think you can have the awards on the commercial success, but you can't. But when you get the commercial success, I feel like the awards probably, I mean, they'd naturally roll in a little more. I mean, how many books do you find that are New York Times bestsellers and they don't win anything? Like that's from what I've seen at least, that's pretty rare. Like most books that I've seen that are New York Times bestselling or best-selling series, the books have all automatically they win the awards because I mean, if the people like it, then it's gonna get what it
That's it.
deserves.
The people like it. I mean, just what you said is right. And plus, a book that becomes a bestseller draws attention. It
Mm-hmm.
draws attention from people who give awards. So certainly there's some of that. Now there are a lot of awards that are given to books that nobody's ever heard of,
Yeah.
and even after the award comes and goes, they've still never heard of it. And I mean, it's good for the author that they got an award, but I kind of like the commercial aspect of it too.
Um, what has been, would you say, the most fun that you've had writing a book? Or like you just really enjoyed the research more than you maybe have the other books?
I was at an event, giving a talk. I was on tour at an event in St. Louis, Missouri,
Oh,
and it
where I
actually
live.
it was for the Korea book. And I'm standing up in front of an audience of about 200 people, and right on the front row, there's a guy in a wheelchair, very elderly gentleman, and his son wheels him in, and he sits right up front. And I didn't know anything about this guy. I mean, I appreciate that he went to the trouble to come out to hear my talk. So
Mhm.
I'm talking about this, and I said something about Douglas MacArthur, and I said something about the Marines, and how the Marines didn't particularly like Douglas MacArthur, and and so forth. And I go out on a limb when I say something like that, because you every now and then there'll be somebody in the audience who thinks Douglas MacArthur is the greatest thing in the world, and I've just insulted the guy. But this guy suddenly pipes up in the middle of my talk and just interrupts me and said, "I got news for you," and I'm waiting for it. Like, oh no, what's he going to say? And he says, "I know 15,000 Marines that can't stand Douglas MacArthur." And he was one of them because he was there. And I mean, that just tickled me. I mean, I made as much as I could. I made friends with the guy
Mhm.
because I mean that's as gratifying as anything else. When you reach somebody, when you write something that affects somebody on an emotional level, and I get people respond to some of the things I've written. And when I say emotional, I mean really emotional, tears in their eyes. I mean, there's no substitute for that. When someone comes up to you and mentions, well, whether it's Tommy Biggs or whoever it might be, and they say, "My God, that story, it just really touched me," and they're emotional about it. What's better than that? I
Mhm.
mean, for a writer to know that you've been able to touch somebody, to touch them in their heart, that's fabulous. And I don't know what's better than that.
Yeah, I mean, and especially with like the nature of your books, right? Your books revolve around famous historical events in which, I mean, a lot of people I'm sure are able to make personal connections to.
Oh,
And
sure. I mean, and even going back in history, as far back as the American Revolution, I meet people that have relatives, that are descendant from someone that have ancestors, and I mean, people write me letters all the time and say, "Oh, you mentioned so and so, some general, I'm his great great granddaughter." I mean, I get that kind of stuff, and I mean, that's very cool. I mean, that people appreciate being recognized for what their ancestor did, and it's great. All that's all good stuff.
is there a certain book that you're just the most proud of?
Well, I mentioned the Korea book. I keep going back to that because I think that's probably of all. But then I have to say, my new book, which comes out in May 16th, Tuesday. The old hell, you've got a copy, okay? um, that's different from anything I've done. It's not a military oriented book at all. I mean, certainly you've got Teddy Roosevelt in there and during the Spanish American War. I mean, that's one small part of it. but I did an enormous amount of research on this man. I loved this character. And so far, the response that that book has drawn from reviewers and the people that got advanced copies has been tremendous.
Hmm.
I don't know how that's going to translate to how the book's going to do when it comes out to the public, but I'm proud of that one, and I'm hoping it's as good as I think it might be, and that's really about the best thing I can say.
I mean, yeah, on the back of the book, you've got some big reviewers, and I mean, it looks there's nothing but good reviews. Really, you can tell like genuine reviews in the back. And I've been so caught up with like school finals and APs where I'm planning on starting to read this tonight. So I'm really excited for this one because this actually relates. We're just talking about in my history class, we just had a test the other day on US diplomacy throughout the years. So like I don't know much about Roosevelt except like his big stick diplomacy and like
Yep.
pretty much that stuff. But like I don't know much about him, but that this fits in perfectly because like I read in the books and do with Spanish American War, and we just had a test on this stuff. So I'm like, okay, I'll just get some extra knowledge
Well,
in.
he's the thing I'll say about Roosevelt too is, from my point of view as the writer, he's fun. You know, he is such a hoot to write because he has such a personality and he's such a character. And you know, I titled the book "The Old Lion" because it takes place partly late in his life,
Hmm.
when he's toward the end of his life, when he's thinking back to some of the things that he did, and then I take you back and show you and take you there, some of the experiences that he had in trying to be a cattle rancher in the Dakotas, you know, being a cowboy, being in the Amazon, exploring the Amazon, which almost kills him. I mean, all these kinds of things, as well as being president of the United States.
Hmm.
But he's a fun character to write. And I think a lot of people like him, regardless of my book. I think a lot of people like him. He's one of the favorite presidents that people
Hmm.
always mention. So I'm really proud of this, and I hope it does well.
Have you I don't know, is there any way that you've had like any of his descendants that
There
have
are
heard
some
about
out
the book?
there. Nobody's written me yet. I'm sure I'll hear from somebody.
Hmm.
Uh, but yeah, but there are. I mean, his immediate descendants, of course, are all gone.
Yeah.
But he has a couple of great grandchildren that are out there. I'm always curious what their response will be.
Hmm. Um, in all of the time now, so your first book that came out was it 1996?
Right, Gods and Generals.
You've been writing for close to around 30 years, close to like 27, I guess.
Right.
What is the biggest lesson that you think you've taken away from just writing?
Do your homework. Don't take shortcuts. I know writers that, you know, well, one downside of that is that there are people that will take 10 years and work on a book and never get finished with it because
Mhm.
they don't believe they've done enough homework. At some point, you have to put it down and say, okay, I'm done. And that's another lesson too, is, you know, when you've done the homework and it feels like a good story, trust your instinct. You know, this is probably true for anybody who wants to be a writer, is believe in yourself. I mean, if you want to do this, tell a good story, and let the book chips fall where they may. But if you've told a good story, be proud of that. Be happy with that. And that's one thing in every book I've done. I'm confident that it's a good story. It may not be your story. It may not be a story that appeals to everybody. That's okay. But
Mhm.
it's a story that I'm proud of, and it's a story that I think works.
This is one question that I always like to ask to every author. Um, if there's somebody right now who's listening or watching this and says, I want to be an author someday, what is the piece of advice aside from do your homework that you would give someone?
Well, first of all, I would ignore all those how-to books that you can find in any bookstore. There'll be a whole shelf of books of how to be a writer. None of those books are going to tell you anything. What you need to do is, first of all, as I said, have faith in yourself. If this is something you want to do, sit down and write. My father used to teach his creative writing students at Florida State. He said, if you want to be a writer, you have to use the BIC method, BIC, butt in chair. It's not going to happen until you put your butt in the chair and put the words on paper. And and again, if you're nervous about it, if you're scared about it, that's okay. But put the words on paper. Do it. Leave it up to somebody else whether or not you're a good writer. Leave it up to an editor whether or not your work needs to be edited. That comes later. Put it on paper. Get it on. Get it out there, and read it, edit it yourself if you want to. Clean it up as whatever you think it needs cleaned up. But have faith in yourself. Tell and focus on the one thing. And I don't care, and I've said this many times, I don't care if you're writing about your dog, about your grandfather, about your next door neighbor. Keep in mind, make it a good story. Show it, don't tell it. If you're going to show me about your dog, take me with your dog somewhere. I mean, I know maybe this sounds sort of silly, but it applies. Show the story, put me in the setting, put me, the reader, put me there. Show me what happens. Don't just tell me. Don't just write a bunch of narrative. And I think, whether or not you're a good writer is up to somebody else, but you have to start there.
Awesome. I just have one last question. And then, so is there any experience that you would say that you've just been able to, with you being in the position that you are, with being a New York Times bestselling author, anything that you've ever been able to do, or just an experience that you've had that was just like, it took you back for a second and you're like, this is my life. Like I'm great. So grateful for what I'm able to do. And you were like, you realized how much of a blessing being able to be an author is.
When I mentioned before that the Congressional Medal of Honor Society gave me an award, they gave me their Bob Hope Award for entertainment. I'm only the second author that's won it. Stephen Ambrose was the first. And I stood in this ballroom at this hotel in Boulder, Colorado. And the room was packed full of people. Everybody's the Marines there were all in dress blues, the Army, the Air Force guys, all in their dress uniforms. Everybody else is in a tuxedo. I'm in a tuxedo. And I stood up when they gave me this award, and I'm standing there, and I was told, and I'm looking out across this room. At that point, there were 74 living recipients of the Medal of Honor. We're still, 74 of them were still alive. 37 of them were in that room. And I'm standing up talking to these people, 37 genuine heroes. I learned so much just by dealing with them. These are guys, they hate wearing their medal. Nobody wants to stand up and say, yeah, I got a Medal of Honor. No, because they know somebody else probably died for them to get that medal. And they're the most humble group of people I've ever met. And I'm standing up there, and they hand me this incredible award, this big copper thing, a beautiful award. And it's all about me. And I'm looking out at this audience thinking, no, it's not all about me. It's about them. And I remember that moment, and I don't know that I'll ever equal that, but to have them recognize me for being a writer, and for recognizing the books that I've done, that was huge. And I don't know that I've ever felt more proud of anything than that particular evening.
Perfect. Thank you so much for coming on, Mr. Shaara. It's been a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you so much. Everybody who's watching, please make sure check out his new book, The Old Lion. You said, I believe, May 16th.
Yes, Tuesday, May 16th.
May 16th should hit the shelves. And thank you for everybody who's watching, and I will see you in the next video.